This is Jason from Laundry List, and today we're speaking with...
My name's Amrita.
You have frequently asked questions about not just laundromats, but business.
Mm-hmm.
You're always been curious about business and laundromats, and you would ask questions about what it's like owning a business or owning a laundromat. And you told me that someday you'd like to have your own laundromat.
This is still true.
Every once in a while, you will send me a text from a laundromat.
That is
true.
And
it doesn't matter where in the world you are.
That's true.
You're like, what do you think of this laundromat? This segues nicely into how do you buy a laundromat and what is the process from when you first think you might want to buy a laundromat? What does that process look like? How do you get to laundromat ownership, whether you're in your late 20s, your 30s, and the other demographic is people over the age of 50 where they're looking to either retire with passive income or one foot out the door in full-time employment, and they want to begin to replace income without having to work 40 hours or 50 hours a week. Because there are people watching that do want to take those steps to get from point A to point B into laundromat ownership. Because for me, I didn't really think about it. I had the capital. I bought a laundromat. It was one of 6 or 7 or 8 different businesses I've owned over the years. That's not the majority of people that are looking to get into laundromats. Do you know what the path would be for you to get into laundromats?
Being in a place where you can see yourself for a long time. I also am new to working, and I want to save money so I can actually invest in a laundromat and be in a place where I'm not struggling to get started. And
so that to me is one of the smartest things you could have said about when you want to take the first step to getting into business. And I've recommended this in a previous podcast. I think it's so important to have a little bit of financial stability, which is exactly what you're talking about. You need to save enough money where you're not shackled by every decision, because you won't have the freedom to make the right decisions if you don't have the capital or the money to do it. Let's suppose that you decide you're going to buy a laundromat, and now you see a laundromat you're interested in. What do?
First, I bug the owner.
A different owner, not me.
Yeah,
well, you'll text me too.
It could be your laundromat, maybe. Bug the owner. And I think one of the key things I learned from you is perseverance, because you bugged the owner many, many times, the previous owner to this laundromat. I think I'd also need to do my own background research.
All right, well, let's start there. So background research, where do you start? What would your instincts tell you about background research? Because a lot of people, when they first think they want to buy a laundromat, it starts with background research. And I think it's actually pretty simple, but where would you start?
Revenue areas and cost areas. All
right, so revenue and cost. Even before you get to revenue and cost, the first thing I'd recommend to anyone, check Google ratings, Google reviews, Google business profile. That will tell you so much. For example, let's suppose there's a laundromat that you like. It has 3.6 stars, right? Maybe there's 50 reviews. You begin to look at the reviews. You begin to learn a little bit about the owner, because people are going to say nice and bad things, and you're going to take the average. But if you begin to see a pattern, and by the way, 3.6, you can do better, right? To me, that's an opportunity. And maybe there's a reason. Maybe someone else bought the laundromat and it had terrible reviews before they bought it, and they didn't have the ability to increase those ratings, in the short amount of time that they've owned it. But from the Google reviews, you can piece together a picture of a laundromat. There's also going to be pictures. So you can begin to look at the pictures. So even if I'm not sitting, in Boston or wherever someone is living when they want to buy a laundromat, I can look in Google and begin to see what's going on with this laundromat, right? If you find out that the owner is a nice person and they're getting some good reviews in the last, let's say 12 months, that owner is probably approachable, right? That'll give you a sense for, is this an owner that might be receptive to a phone call? Like when you called me, I didn't hang up the phone, right? If you were to look at the reviews that I have, you might begin to sense, all right, this is a guy that might actually, whether he wants to sell or not, he may actually take my phone call and meet with me, because he's he knows there's nothing to lose by having a conversation. So I would start with Google reviews. Then what's the next thing that you do? You want to look at revenue and expense. How do you do that? Because you can't just walk into especially an unattended laundromat and say, hey, can you tell me how much money you make? Because a lot of people won't share that information.
Are there sites online that give good advice on kind of doing that kind of assessment?
besides this channel? Actually, a website called Laundromat Resource, and they have a bunch of tools. But even before you get into those tools, my advice would be walk into the laundromat, take a look around. Number one, how much do they charge for a wash? If they charge, and let's just keep the number simple, if they charge $5 for a wash and they have 20 machines, you know on average across the United States, the number of turns per day, that means how many times is that machine used per day. If the average turns per day is 2.6, which let's just round up and say 3, you know one machine is producing $15 of revenue per day, right? If they have 20 machines, now you multiply that. So you can begin to put together the revenue perspective.
Is that true?
That's pretty much true.
3
you're going to be fairly accurate. The average turns per day across the country, I believe, is 2.7.
Oh wow!
Right, as an average.
Would be higher.
Everyone does. Why do you think people do wash, dry, fold? Because it's a way to utilize the machines without having customers coming in, because they know that the machines are very underutilized. Once you know your revenue of the washing machines, what's the next revenue number that you need? Dryers. Dryers tend to be anywhere from 35 to 45% of your wash revenue. So if your wash revenue is, let's say, $100 a day, your drying revenue is going to be $40. So now in one day, you know that laundromat's doing $140. Multiply it times 30, and you can begin to piece together what the revenue looks like. Now, the one complication about knowing what the total revenue is, you have to know what percentage of their business is wash, dry, fold, because that's very different pricing. The amount of revenue per wash is going to be very different than on a self-service unattended laundromat. But once you know your revenue, now you can begin to figure out what the expenses are. Well, if you were to do your research, you'd probably see that utilities tend to run at, let's just say, 20% of your revenue. Your rent, your target is you want it to be around 25% of your total revenue, but maybe it's closer to 40 or 50%. You know, it depends on the area, depends on the volume of the business.
Right.
So your rent's going to be big, utilities are going to be big, and the other big expense tends to be labor, if it's a wash, dry, fold. I don't have labor because this is an unattended laundromat. I don't do wash, dry, fold. So what are the other things? Maintenance. Maybe that's going to run at 5% of your revenue. Eventually, you begin to piece together what you think the numbers look like before you've even spoken to the owner. This is Jason from Laundry List.
The best place for brainwashing.